The air hung thick and cloying, heavy with the scent of beeswax, stale perfume, and the faint, metallic tang of fear. Eleanor, no more than 16, felt the rough linen of her apron chafe against her raw hands as she polished the silver ewer, its surface reflecting her distorted, weary face like a funhouse mirror. A sudden sharp clang from the adjacent antechamber, a dropped tray, a shattered porcelain teacup, sent a jolt through the entire staff, a collective intake of breath. You felt it too, that sudden tightening in your gut, the frantic scramble to appear busy, invisible, perfect. A single mistake could mean a beating, dismissal, or worse, banishment to the unforgiving streets outside the palace's towering walls. Inside, a gilded cage shimmered, but its bars were forged from endless toil, unyielding hierarchy, and the ever-present, terrifying proximity to absolute power. This was not a life of quiet service. It was a relentless, often brutal, fight for survival, played out in the opulent shadows of royalty. The first light of dawn, a pale, anemic wash, barely pierced the grimy windows of the servants' quarters, yet it was more than enough to rouse the hundreds of souls condemned to its dim embrace. For young Thomas, barely 13, the shrill, insistent clang of the bell from the head footman's quarters was a visceral shock, tearing him from the fleeting comfort of a dream where he was back in his village, chasing geese across a sun-drenched field. Here, in the sprawling, labyrinthine heart of Kensington Palace, such simple joys were distant echoes, fading memories in the face of an overwhelming, oppressive reality. His small, calloused hands, already bearing the telltale nicks and burns of his scullery apprenticeship, trembled as he fumbled for his coarse uniform, the stiff wool scratching against his sleep-deprived skin. You too would have felt that cold dread, that gnawing anxiety that settled in your stomach each morning, knowing the day ahead would demand every ounce of your strength, your spirit, and your subservience. Thomas was but one of hundreds, an insignificant cog in the vast, intricate machinery that kept the royal household running with a terrifying, almost supernatural precision. He was a new arrival, fresh from the rural quietude of Dorset, thrust into a world of unimaginable opulence and equally unimaginable brutality. His initial awe at the palace's grandeur had quickly curdled into a perpetual state of bewildered terror. The sheer scale of it, endless corridors each more richly decorated than the last, leading to rooms that sparkled with jewels, gold, and silk, yet remained utterly devoid of human warmth. He learned quickly that these opulent spaces were not for him, not for any of them. They were merely backdrops, stages upon which the lives of the truly privileged played out, while he and his kind moved through the periphery, ghost-like, unseen, unheard. His days were a blur of steam, grease, and the clatter of copper pots. The scullery, a subterranean inferno, reeked of stale food and unwashed humanity. The heat was relentless, a suffocating blanket that clung to his skin, making his lungs burn. His superior, Mrs. Higgins, a woman whose face was perpetually set in a grimace of weary resignation, moved through the chaos with a terrifying efficiency, her sharp tongue lashing out at any perceived slowness or imperfection. "Faster, boy. The king's dinner waits for no man, least of all a country bumpkin like you," she'd snarl, her words cutting deeper than any physical blow. Thomas would flinch, his head bowed, scrubbing harder until his fingers were raw and bleeding, the scent of his own fear mingling with the kitchen's cacophony. He quickly understood that his identity, his very sense of self, was being systematically dismantled. He was no longer Thomas, the boy who loved to climb oak trees and dream of adventure. He was boy, scullery, you there? His individuality was an inconvenient luxury, stripped away and replaced with a uniform of anonymity. He existed only to serve, to facilitate, to disappear. The palace, with its towering walls and impenetrable gates, was not just a physical prison. It was a psychological one too. The rules were endless, unwritten yet universally understood, enforced by a hierarchy as rigid and unyielding as the stone foundations beneath their feet. Never speak unless spoken to. Never look a royal in the eye. Never walk through a main corridor if a service passage was available. Never, ever forget your place. You too would have felt the crushing weight of these unspoken laws, the constant vigilance required to navigate a world where a single misstep could lead to ruin. Imagine the terror of hearing a royal's approaching footsteps, knowing you must melt into the shadows, become a part of the wall, lest you be seen, a smudge on their pristine vision of the world. The silence of the upper floors, broken only by the rustle of silk or the tinkle of a distant bell, was more intimidating than the clamor of the kitchens. It was a silence that demanded absolute deference, a stillness that mirrored the stillness expected of your own soul. His first week, Thomas witnessed a footman, a handsome young man named Arthur, caught smiling at a lady-in-waiting. The smile was innocent, perhaps even a gesture of shared exhaustion, but it was interpreted as familiarity, an unforgivable transgression. Arthur was dismissed on the spot, his belongings bundled and thrown out with him into the unforgiving London streets, his pleas and protests echoing uselessly against the closed gates. The palace had simply swallowed him whole and spat him out, leaving no trace. Thomas learned then that kindness was a luxury and human connection, a dangerous indulgence. He learned that the greatest skill a servant could possess was the ability to be present yet absent, seen yet invisible, to exist without truly existing. The invisible walls of his gilded cage were not made of stone, but of expectation, fear, and the profound, chilling indifference of those he served. His dreams, once vibrant and hopeful, began to fade, replaced by the dull ache of an existence defined by endless toil and the crushing weight of his own insignificance. He was a shadow, and shadows, he knew, had no dreams. The silence of the upper floors was a different beast entirely from the boisterous din of the kitchens. It was a silence pregnant with unspoken words, a vast echoing void where every rustle of a silk gown, every distant cough, every barely audible whisper carried the weight of a potential secret. For Eleanor, a chambermaid tasked with the meticulous upkeep of the Queen's private apartments, this oppressive quiet was a constant companion, a heavy blanket that smothered her own thoughts and forced her into an hyper-aware state of perpetual eavesdropping. You, standing there, duster in hand, would feel the prickle of unease on your skin, the subtle tension in the air, knowing that these grand gilded rooms were not just spaces, but stages for elaborate, often dangerous, dramas. Eleanor was a creature of habit, moving through the Queen's chambers with the precision of a well-oiled machine. Every fold of linen, every polished surface, every arrangement of flowers was a testament to her unwavering dedication. Yet, beneath this veneer of dutiful efficiency, her mind was a whirlwind of observations, conjectures, and anxieties. The palace was a living, breathing entity, and its breath was gossip, its pulse the frantic beat of political intrigue. Servants, often dismissed as mere furniture, were in fact the eyes and ears of the household, privy to the most intimate details of royal lives, the most hushed conversations of courtiers. This knowledge was both a burden and a potential weapon, a double-edged sword that could secure one's precarious position or lead to swift, brutal downfall. One afternoon, while meticulously arranging the Queen's collection of porcelain figurines, Eleanor overheard a hushed conversation from the adjoining dressing room. The Queen, her voice a low, throaty murmur, was speaking with her closest lady-in-waiting, Lady Finch. "The Duke of Northumberland, my dear. He presses for this alliance with France against all reason. The king is swayed, I fear, by his honeyed words." Lady Finch's reply was equally soft, yet laced with a subtle venom. "Indeed, your majesty. But his wife, the Duchess, she has been seen often in the company of Lord Ashworth, a known proponent of the Spanish marriage. Could it be a calculated distraction?" Eleanor froze, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. The porcelain figurine, a delicate shepherdess, felt impossibly fragile in her trembling fingers. She knew the Duke of Northumberland was a powerful figure, his political machinations capable of shifting the fate of the nation. To hear of his potential deceit, and the scandalous hint of his wife's infidelity with a rival faction supporter, was like peering into a dangerous abyss. You would feel that icy grip of fear, the sudden realization that you were privy to knowledge that could shatter careers, ignite wars, or even cost lives. The palace was a hotbed of such whispers. Kitchen staff knew who was having a secret affair based on late-night food orders. Footmen knew of impending financial ruin by the tenor of a lord's voice. Chambermaids knew of royal pregnancies before the physicians by the queen's morning sickness. This constant flow of information, passed in hushed tones between laundry maids, stable boys, and pages, formed an invisible network, a web of interconnected secrets that bound them all. Trust was a luxury rarely afforded, and betrayal, a constant threat. A careless word, a misinterpreted glance, a misplaced letter, any of these could ignite a wildfire of suspicion and retribution. Eleanor recalled the fate of Martha, a laundry maid. Martha had, perhaps innocently, mentioned to a scullery boy that the queen had been wearing a particular nightgown, one that the queen's sister, the Princess Royal, was known to detest. The scullery boy, seeking to curry favor, had repeated this to a junior valet, who in turn, seeking to gain an advantage, had twisted the tale, implying Martha had been mocking the queen's taste. The rumor, distorted and magnified, reached the ears of the mistress of the robes, a woman renowned for her draconian discipline. Martha was accused of insolence, publicly humiliated, and banished from the palace, her reputation irrevocably stained. You would remember Martha's tear-streaked face, her desperate, futile pleas, and understand that in this world, even the most innocuous observation could be weaponized against you. The constant surveillance was another pervasive layer of terror. Not just the surveillance of superiors but of fellow servants. Everyone watched everyone else, not out of malice necessarily, but out of a desperate need for self-preservation. To report a transgression, even a minor one, could be seen as an act of loyalty, a safeguard against one's own vulnerability. To fail to report, to be seen as complicit, was an even graver risk. Eleanor often felt the weight of unseen eyes, the imagined whispers that followed her, dissecting her every move. She learned to cultivate an expression of blank neutrality, to keep her gaze downcast, her movements precise and unhurried. Her thoughts, however, raced, analyzing every nuance, every inflection in the voices she overheard. The Queen's conversation continued, drifting to the King's health, his recent melancholic moods, and a strange new herbal tonic prescribed by his physician. Eleanor absorbed it all, not out of morbid curiosity, but out of a primal instinct for survival. This knowledge, dangerous as it was her currency, her protection. It allowed her to anticipate moods, to understand underlying currents, to predict the unpredictable whims of those in power. Yet, it also left her perpetually on edge, a silent witness to a grand drama in which she was an unwilling, yet utterly indispensable participant. As she finally finished her dusting, the shepherdess figurine gleaming innocently in the muted light, Eleanor knew that the true power of the palace lay not in its visible grandeur, but in the unseen currents of information, the dangerous dance of whispers and shadows that dictated the fate of both kings and commoners alike. The silence of the halls was not emptiness, but a roaring symphony of secrets, and she, a mere chambermaid, was trapped within its terrifying, alluring melody. The relentless bell that summoned the servants to their duties each morning was not merely a call to work. It was a physical blow, a jarring assault on bodies already pushed to their absolute limits. For Agnes, a kitchen maid whose hands were perpetually chapped and raw from endless washing and scouring, the sound was a harbinger of another day of back-breaking labor, a day that would stretch into an eternity of aching muscles and gnawing hunger. You too would have felt that profound weariness settle into your bones, a tiredness so deep it seemed to permeate your very soul, making every movement a struggle against an invisible, crushing weight. Agnes was barely 18, yet her face, prematurely etched with lines of exhaustion, made her appear years older. Her life in the palace kitchen was a brutal, unforgiving cycle. From before dawn until long after dusk, she was on her feet, tending to roaring fires that scorched her skin, lifting heavy iron pots that strained her back, chopping vegetables until her wrists ached with a dull, persistent throb. The kitchen was a maelstrom of activity, a symphony of sizzling fat, clanging metal, and the shouted commands of the head cook, a tyrannical man named Master Fitzwilliam, whose temper was as fiery as the ovens he presided over. He moved through the chaos like a malevolent storm cloud, his bellowing voice striking fear into the hearts of all beneath him. "Agnes, the potatoes. Are you dreaming, girl? The king's supper will be late, and it will be your head on the chopping block, not mine." The physical toll was immense. Her feet, perpetually swollen, ached with a deep, throbbing pain that never truly subsided. Her back was a constant knot of tension, a testament to the countless hours spent bent over tables, scrubbing floors, or carrying heavy loads of firewood from the cellars below. Sleep, when it came, was fitful and brief, snatched in a cramped, airless dormitory shared with a dozen other maids, where the collective snores and restless sighs created a cacophony that offered little true rest. Dreams were a luxury she could rarely afford, and when they did intrude, they were often nightmares of Master Fitzwilliam's scowling face or the terrifying prospect of dropping a precious platter. But more insidious than the physical pain was the constant, pervasive hunger. While the royal tables groaned under the weight of extravagant feasts, roasted meats, delicate pastries, exotic fruits, the servants' fare was meager and monotonous. A thin gruel for breakfast, often little more than stale bread and weak ale for lunch, and a stew for supper that was mostly broth and cheap vegetables, sometimes with a few scraps of gristle if they were lucky. The irony was a bitter pill, to be surrounded by an abundance of food, to prepare dishes of incredible richness and variety, yet to feel the constant gnawing emptiness in your own stomach. You would feel that desperate pang, the way your eyes would linger on the discarded crusts, the half-eaten portions, the scraps that were swept away, knowing that a single morsel would feel like a feast. Stealing food was an unspeakable crime, punishable by severe beatings, public humiliation, or instant dismissal. Yet the temptation was a constant, almost unbearable pressure. Agnes had seen kitchen boys, driven by desperation, attempt to snatch a piece of bread or a sliver of cheese, only to be caught, their hands brutally slapped or even branded. The memory of young Peter, a new apprentice, caught with a stolen apple, his face contorted in pain and shame as Master Fitzwilliam lashed him with a cane, was a vivid, terrifying warning that kept Agnes's own hunger in check, though it never truly disappeared. One particularly grueling day, after an elaborate royal banquet, Agnes was left with the monumental task of cleaning the vast array of silver platters and ornate serving dishes. The kitchen was finally quiet, save for the crackle of the dying fires and the rhythmic splashing of water. Her body screamed in protest, her hands raw and aching. As she scraped the last remnants from a silver tureen, her eyes fell upon a small, untouched portion of roasted pheasant, a delicacy she had only ever smelled, never tasted. The rich, savory aroma was intoxicating, a siren call to her famished stomach. Her heart pounded, a frantic drumbeat in her ears. No one was watching. Master Fitzwilliam had retired. The other maids were asleep. Her hand trembled as she reached for it, her fingers brushing against the cold, succulent meat. For a fleeting moment, the hunger, the exhaustion, the sheer desperation overcame her fear. She imagined the taste, the fleeting satisfaction, the tiny rebellion against a life of deprivation. You would feel that intense pull, that agonizing choice between survival and the risk of absolute ruin. Just as her fingers curled around the morsel, a floorboard creaked behind her. Agnes froze, her breath catching in her throat. A shadow loomed. It was old Bess, one of the older, more experienced kitchen maids, her face a roadmap of hard-won wisdom and countless sorrows. Bess said nothing, her eyes, deep and knowing, simply rested on Agnes, then on the pheasant, then back to Agnes. There was no judgment, only a profound, heartbreaking understanding. Slowly, Agnes withdrew her hand, the phantom taste of the pheasant a cruel mockery in her mouth. Bess nodded, a single, almost imperceptible gesture, and then turned to continue her own endless task of scrubbing the floor. The moment passed, a silent exchange of shared suffering and unspoken warning. Agnes understood. The scraps of food were not just food, they were a symbol of their place, their subservience, their utter lack of control. To take them was to challenge the very order of the palace, an order that was enforced with brutal efficiency. As she resumed her scrubbing, the water stinging her chapped hands, the hunger remained, a dull, persistent ache. But it was no longer just a physical sensation. It was a hunger for dignity, for recognition, for a life where she was not defined by the scraps she was permitted to eat, or the endless toil that consumed her waking hours. The crushing weight of her existence was not just the physical labor, but the constant erosion of her spirit, the slow, agonizing realization that her life was merely a backdrop to the opulent feasts of others, a shadow in a world of blinding light. And as the first rays of dawn once again threatened to break through the grimy window, Agnes knew that the bell would soon clang again, pulling her back into the relentless cycle of hunger, toil, and the profound, aching emptiness of a life lived on the fringes of abundance. In the vast, impersonal machinery of the royal palace, human connection was a dangerous anomaly, a fragile spark that threatened to ignite a conflagration of scandal and ruin. For the servants, whose lives were dictated by rigid schedules and the omnipresent gaze of superiors, love was not a luxury to be indulged, but a perilous secret to be guarded with every fiber of their being. You would feel that aching void, that profound yearning for intimacy in a world designed to keep you isolated, a world where even a stolen glance could be misinterpreted, and a whispered word could lead to catastrophe. Isabel, a young lady's maid in the service of the king's youngest daughter, Princess Amelia, understood this brutal truth all too well. Her days were spent in the princess's sun-drenched apartments, brushing silken hair, lacing corsets and mending delicate gowns. She moved with an almost ethereal grace, her quiet efficiency masking a fierce, yearning heart. Isabel was an observer, a silent witness to the princess's own romantic entanglements, the hushed letters, the clandestine meetings, the forbidden glances across crowded ballrooms. The princess, shielded by her royal status, could indulge in such follies with relative impunity, though even for her, the stakes were high. For Isabel, the stakes were absolute. Her forbidden affection bloomed in the most unlikely of places. The palace gardens, during the brief, stolen moments when she was permitted to air the princess's linens. It was there, amidst the manicured roses and fragrant lavender, that she met Gabriel, a stable hand with eyes the color of warm honey and a smile that could melt the winter frost. Gabriel was a creature of the outside world, his hands strong and calloused from working with horses, his face weathered by sun and wind. He represented everything the palace was not: freedom, simplicity, and a raw, untamed passion. Their encounters were fleeting, dangerous dances in the shadows. A shared glance across the stable yard, a quick, whispered word behind a hedge, a brush of hands as he helped her carry a heavy basket of laundry. Each interaction was charged with an electric tension, a delicious fear that was both exhilarating and terrifying. You would know that thrill, that desperate surge of adrenaline that accompanied every stolen moment, every fleeting touch, knowing that discovery meant not just personal heartbreak, but a complete shattering of your precarious existence. The palace rules regarding relationships among servants were explicit and draconian. Marriage was generally forbidden without express permission, which was rarely granted, especially for those in positions of close proximity to the royals. Any hint of improper conduct could lead to immediate dismissal, often with a ruined reputation that made finding future employment impossible. For women, the consequences were even more severe. Pregnancy out of wedlock meant certain expulsion, often into a life of destitution and shame. The palace demanded absolute loyalty, absolute focus, and absolute celibacy from its staff, at least in theory. In practice, clandestine affairs were rampant, a desperate rebellion against the dehumanizing strictures of their lives, but they were always conducted under a shroud of intense secrecy. Isabel and Gabriel's connection deepened with each stolen moment. They spoke of their dreams, Gabriel of saving enough coin to buy a small plot of land, Isabel of a life where she could make her own choices, however humble. Their shared vulnerability, their mutual understanding of the palace's suffocating grip, forged a bond of profound intimacy. One moonless night, driven by a desperate longing, they met in a secluded corner of the kitchen gardens, hidden amongst the overgrown espaliered fruit trees. The air was cool and sweet with the scent of night-blooming jasmine. Their hands found each other, then their lips, a tender, desperate kiss that tasted of forbidden fruit and the terrifying promise of a future that might never be. But the palace had eyes everywhere. A disgruntled scullery boy, jealous of Gabriel's easy charm, had noticed their frequent, lingering glances. He reported it to the head groom, a stern, unyielding man who valued order above all else. The head groom, in turn, informed the mistress of the robes, Isabel's direct superior, a woman whose puritanical sensibilities were legendary. The discovery was swift and brutal. Isabel was summoned to the mistress's private sitting room, a cold, austere space where the silence was more accusatory than any shout. The mistress, her face a mask of icy disapproval, laid out the accusations. Improper conduct, Isabel. Fraternizing with a stable hand. Bringing shame upon this household and the princess you serve. Isabel's heart plummeted to her stomach. She felt a profound, chilling despair. You would feel that utter helplessness, the sudden collapse of your world as the consequences of your deepest desires crashed down upon you. Isabel denied nothing, but her silence was taken as an admission of guilt. Gabriel, too, was confronted, his defiance met with a harsh beating from the head groom, a stark reminder of his place. Neither of them betrayed the other, a testament to the strength of their bond, even in the face of such overwhelming odds. But their defiance was futile. Isabel was dismissed, her meager belongings packed and placed outside the servants' entrance. Her reputation was shattered, making future employment in any respectable household impossible. Gabriel, though not dismissed outright, was transferred to a remote royal estate in the countryside, a punishment designed to separate them permanently, a slow, agonizing banishment. As Isabel was led away, her eyes met Gabriel's across the sprawling courtyard. In his gaze she saw not just sorrow, but a profound, shared understanding of the crushing price of their forbidden affections. The palace, in its cold, efficient manner, had excised the anomaly, extinguished the dangerous spark. Isabel walked out into the cold, indifferent streets of London, her heart aching with a grief that felt too vast for her small frame. She carried with her not just the shame of her dismissal, but the haunting memory of Gabriel's warm smile and the fleeting taste of a love that was never meant to be. The palace had taught her a cruel lesson. In the gilded cage, the most precious human connections were often the most dangerous, and the yearning for love, a luxury that could cost you everything. And as you watched her go, you would feel the weight of that truth, the profound, chilling realization that even the most innocent human desires were considered a threat to the rigid, unyielding order of the royal world. The world of the servants was a constant performance, a perpetual dance of deference and invisibility, all played out under the unseen yet ever-present shadow of the royal gaze. This gaze, capricious and unpredictable, could elevate a servant to a fleeting moment of favor or cast them into the deepest abyss of despair with a single word, a single fleeting whim. For William, a footman whose life revolved around the precise timing of tea services and the immaculate presentation of royal chambers, this proximity to power was a source of constant, nerve-wracking tension. You would feel that icy thrill, that profound anxiety that accompanied every direct interaction, knowing that your fate could be decided by the most trivial of royal moods. William was a man of quiet dignity, his uniform pristine, his demeanor impeccable. He prided himself on his professionalism, his ability to anticipate needs before they were voiced, to move through the royal presence like a silent, efficient phantom. He had witnessed firsthand the astonishing spectrum of royal behavior, moments of unexpected, almost disarming kindness, followed by explosions of irrational fury that left the entire household trembling. He knew that the line between favor and disgrace was gossamer thin, easily crossed and rarely forgiving. One crisp autumn morning, William was tasked with serving breakfast to the king himself, a rare and highly coveted duty. The king, known for his volatile temperament and his demanding nature, was seated alone at a vast mahogany table, bathed in the pale light filtering through the tall windows. William moved with practiced grace, placing the silver tray laden with delicate pastries, fresh fruit, and steaming coffee before His Majesty. His movements were precise, his gaze respectfully lowered. You would feel your heart pounding in your chest, the desperate need for every movement to be flawless, every gesture to convey absolute subservience. Suddenly the king cleared his throat, a deep, resonant sound that seemed to vibrate through the entire room. "William," he rumbled, his voice surprisingly gentle. William froze, his hand still hovering over the coffee pot. "Your uniform. It is always so impeccably pressed. Tell me, do you do it yourself?" William, startled by the direct address, stammered slightly. "Why, yes, Your Majesty. It is my duty to ensure I am always presentable." The king chuckled, a surprisingly warm sound. "Indeed. A credit to the household. And your posture always so straight. You remind me of a young oak." He paused, taking a sip of his coffee. "You have a good eye for detail, William. I've noticed you always arrange the morning papers exactly as I prefer them. A small thing perhaps, but appreciated." William felt a flush of warmth spread through him, a strange, intoxicating mix of pride and profound unease. To be noticed, to be praised by the king himself, was an honor beyond measure. For a fleeting moment, he felt a surge of hope, a glimpse of recognition for his tireless efforts. But he also knew the dangers of such fleeting favor. The other servants, particularly the senior footmen, would watch him with a newfound suspicion, a subtle jealousy that could turn venomous. You would feel that unsettling mix of elation and dread, knowing that such attention, while seemingly positive, could also make you a target. The king continued, his mood surprisingly expansive. He asked William about his family, his village, even his thoughts on the unusually mild autumn weather. William, cautious but emboldened by the king's unexpected benevolence, answered respectfully, choosing his words with utmost care. The interaction lasted perhaps 10 minutes, but it felt like an eternity, a surreal dance on the precipice of power. When the king finally dismissed him with a nod, William retreated, his head buzzing, a strange lightness in his step. For the next few days, William found himself the recipient of subtle privileges. Slightly better food portions in the servants' hall, a less demanding rotation of duties, even a rare day off. The other servants, their faces unreadable, watched him, their whispers following him like shadows. He was now the king's favorite, a title that carried both prestige and peril. But royal favor, like the morning mist, was ephemeral. 1 week later, a minor incident shattered William's brief moment in the sun. The king, in a foul mood after a contentious council meeting, discovered a single barely perceptible wrinkle in his silk bedsheets, a flaw that William had meticulously overseen the previous evening. The king's rage was immediate and terrifying. He roared not just at William but at the entire household, accusing them of slovenliness, disrespect, and a fundamental lack of care. William was summoned, his heart sinking with a dreadful certainty. The king, his face contorted with fury, paced before him like a caged lion. "A wrinkle, William? A wrinkle in my bedsheets? Do you think I am blind? Do you think I am so easily deceived by your impeccable service? You are a fraud. A lazy, incompetent fool." The words, sharp and venomous, sliced through William's carefully constructed composure. You would feel the searing shame, the burning humiliation as the man who had praised you now tore you down, his words stripping away your dignity layer by agonizing layer. The king in his fit of pique did not just dismiss William. He ordered him publicly flogged in the courtyard, a brutal punishment for what amounted to an invisible transgression. The lashings were severe, each stripe across William's back a searing testament to the king's absolute power and his own capricious cruelty. As the pain ripped through him, William understood the true nature of the royal gaze. It was not kindness, nor genuine appreciation. It was a fleeting amusement, a momentary distraction, a tool for demonstrating absolute dominion. The praise was as hollow as the accusations were baseless. Both served the same purpose, to remind him and all other servants of their utter insignificance, their complete vulnerability. After the flogging, William was not dismissed, a cruel twist of fate that ensured he would remain in the palace, a living monument to the king's arbitrary power, a broken symbol for the other servants to observe. His spirit, once quietly dignified, was now scarred, his movements more hesitant, his gaze permanently downcast. The memory of the king's fleeting kindness, once a source of pride, now felt like a cruel joke, a lure that had led him to an agonizing downfall. He had learned that in the royal palace, even the most benevolent attention was fraught with danger, and the ultimate price of being seen was often the complete annihilation of oneself. And as you watched him, his back still raw, you would know that the kindness of kings was often more disarming, and ultimately more devastating, than their outright cruelty. The walls of the royal palace were not merely stone and mortar. They were porous membranes, absorbing and holding captive the countless secrets whispered within their confines. Servants, moving through these hallowed halls like silent specters, became unwilling repositories of information, privy to scandals, political machinations, and personal failings that could unravel empires or shatter reputations. For Marie, a skilled seamstress in the queen's private retinue, this burden of knowledge was a suffocating weight, a constant tightrope walk between loyalty and self-preservation. You would feel that chilling awareness, that profound sense of responsibility and danger that came with holding truths that could destroy the very world you inhabited. Marie was a meticulous craftswoman, her nimble fingers capable of transforming swathes of silk and lace into garments of breathtaking beauty. She spent countless hours in the queen's dressing room fitting gowns, mending tiers, and altering designs. This intimate proximity granted her an unparalleled vantage point into the queen's life, a window into a world of both immense privilege and profound vulnerability. She saw the queen's anxieties, her fleeting moments of joy, her deepest frustrations. But more dangerously, she overheard the hushed conversations, the coded messages, the veiled threats that permeated the royal court. One late evening, as Marie was putting the finishing touches on a ball gown, the queen, believing herself alone with her closest confidant, Lady Eleanor, began to speak in urgent, hushed tones. "The Duke of Wellington, Eleanor, he has secured the signatures. The petition to remove Lord Cavendish from his post as First Minister. It is done." Lady Eleanor gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "But Your Majesty, the King trusts Cavendish implicitly. This could ignite a civil war among the factions." The Queen sighed, a weary sound. "Indeed. But Wellington has proof. Letters, incriminating letters, detailing Cavendish's secret dealings with the French ambassador, betraying our own interests for personal gain." Marie's needle froze mid-stitch. Her blood ran cold. Lord Cavendish was not just the First Minister. He was a figure of immense power, a pillar of the current government. To hear of his treasonous dealings and of a plot to remove him was to be privy to a political earthquake in the making. The implications were staggering. If this information were to leak prematurely or fall into the wrong hands, it could destabilize the entire kingdom, perhaps even plunge it into open conflict. You would feel that sudden, sickening lurch in your stomach, the realization that you were standing on the precipice of a national crisis, holding a secret that could determine the fate of millions. This was not the first time Marie had stumbled upon such dangerous knowledge. She had heard whispers of royal infidelities, of hidden debts, of secret alliances and betrayals. The palace was a gilded cage, but also a den of vipers, and the servants, though seemingly insignificant, were often the unwitting witnesses to its most venomous strikes. The burden of these secrets was immense. To speak of them was unthinkable, a direct path to the gallows for treason, or at the very least, a brutal public execution of one's character and livelihood. But to hold them, to carry them in silence, was a psychological torment. Each secret was a heavy stone added to an already unbearable load. Marie remembered the tragic tale of George, a young page who had been found dead in the palace gardens, officially ruled an accident. But the whispers among the servants told a different story. George had been overheard boasting of a great secret he knew about a certain duke. Days later he was gone. The message was clear. Silence was not just preferred, it was mandated by fear, enforced by unseen forces. The difficulty lay not just in keeping silent, but in appearing ignorant. To act as if you knew nothing even when your heart pounded with the weight of devastating truths, required a performance of such profound detachment that it chipped away at your very soul. Marie learned to cultivate a blank expression, to keep her eyes downcast, her responses neutral. Her hands, however, often trembled when she worked on the queen's garments, knowing that the very fabric she held could be stained with the blood of political intrigue. Days turned into weeks. The tension in the palace was palpable, a low hum beneath the surface of polite courtly life. Marie watched Cavendish, his face still radiating confidence, oblivious to the storm brewing around him. She watched Wellington, his eyes gleaming with a predatory satisfaction. She watched the Queen, her face etched with a silent struggle. The secret festered within her, a burning ember of knowledge that threatened to consume her. One evening, a desperate, half-formed thought flickered through Marie's mind. What if she could warn Cavendish? A small, anonymous note, a veiled hint. Perhaps she could prevent the impending disaster, save lives, avert chaos. You would feel that agonizing pull, the moral dilemma tearing at your conscience. To remain silent was to be complicit in a potential injustice. To act was to invite certain destruction upon yourself. She imagined the consequences, the interrogation, the torture, the swift judgment. Her family, living in a small cottage outside the city, would be ruined, their names forever tainted. The image of her mother's tear-streaked face, her father's broken spirit, was enough to extinguish the flicker of rebellion. The weight of her own survival and the survival of those she loved was heavier than any moral imperative. Marie finished the Queen's gown, her fingers moving with an automatic precision, even as her mind reeled. The dress, a shimmering cascade of sapphire silk, was a masterpiece of her craft. The Queen would wear it to the ball where perhaps the Duke of Wellington would make his move. Marie would be there, a silent shadow in the background, a witness to history, a keeper of dangerous truths. She would smooth the Queen's train, adjust her jewels and carry the weight of her secrets, her knowledge a silent, agonizing burden. The palace demanded not just her labor, but her silence, her complicity, her very soul. And as you watched her, her face a mask of serene professionalism, you would know that in the royal palace knowledge was not power, but a heavy, inescapable chain that bound the servants to a life of profound, terrifying peril. The palace, for all its gilded grandeur, was a prison, its walls built not just of stone, but of expectation, hierarchy, and a terrifying lack of options. For many servants, the dream of escape, of a life lived beyond the confines of royal service, was a flickering candle in the pervasive darkness, a desperate hope that often proved to be a cruel illusion. For Samuel, a young kitchen hand with a quick wit and an even quicker temper, this dream was a burning ember, fueling a restless dissatisfaction that simmered beneath his outwardly obedient demeanor. You too would feel that gnawing yearning for freedom, that desperate hope for a life where your destiny was your own, even as the walls of your gilded cage seemed to grow ever higher. Samuel had been pressed into service at the age of 12, his family destitute after his father's sudden death. He hated the suffocating routine, the endless drudgery, the constant humiliation. He was a boy of the docks, of the bustling London streets, where life was harsh but free. Here he was a cog, a nameless, faceless drone in the royal machine. His spirit chafed against the confines, and he spent his meager spare moments poring over tattered maps of London, dreaming of forging a new life, perhaps as a sailor, perhaps as a merchant's apprentice. Anything but this. His resolve hardened after witnessing the brutal dismissal of a young pantry boy who had dared to complain about the meager rations. The boy, barely 10, was thrown out into the streets, his cries echoing through the courtyard as the gates clanged shut behind him. Samuel saw his own fate in that boy's terrified eyes. He understood then that the palace offered no true security, only a temporary reprieve from destitution, bought at the cost of one's soul. He would not become another forgotten shadow. He would escape. His plan was meticulously crafted, woven from weeks of observation and whispered conversations with other discontented souls. He would save every penny of his minuscule wages, forego the occasional pint of ale, resist the temptation of a cheap trinket. He would secure a forged letter of recommendation, claiming to be a distant relative seeking work in a port town far from London. He would slip out during the chaos of a royal procession, when the guards were distracted, their attention fixed on the dazzling spectacle. The risks were immense. Discovery meant not just dismissal but potentially charges of desertion, a criminal offense that could lead to imprisonment or worse. You would feel the knot of fear in your stomach, the terrifying weight of each decision, knowing that a single misstep could shatter your fragile dream. He confided in only one person, Eliza, a laundry maid with eyes as sharp as her wit. Eliza, older and more cynical, had seen many dreams of escape crumble. "Foolish boy," she'd scoffed, though her eyes held a flicker of understanding. "The palace has long arms. It swallows those who try to leave." Yet she helped him, providing him with a small worn satchel, a few scraps of dried meat and a stolen compass. Her act of kindness was a dangerous gamble, a testament to the desperate solidarity that sometimes bloomed amongst the oppressed. The day of the royal procession arrived, a blur of cheering crowds, thundering hooves and the blare of trumpets. Samuel, positioned near a service gate usually left unguarded during such events, felt his heart hammering against his ribs. This was it. His chance. He clutched the satchel, his palms sweating. He could taste freedom, a heady, intoxicating flavor. He imagined the salty air of the docks, the roar of the sea, the boundless horizon of a new life. He waited for the precise moment, the passing of the king's gilded carriage, the surge of the crowd, the momentary distraction of the guards. He took a deep breath, his hands trembling as he pushed open the heavy wooden gate. It creaked, a sound that seemed deafening in his ears. He slipped through into the bustling, vibrant chaos of the London streets. For a glorious, exhilarating moment he was free. The sun felt warmer, the air tasted sweeter, the cacophony of the city a joyous symphony compared to the oppressive silence of the palace. You would feel that surge of triumph, that intoxicating rush of liberation, believing for a fleeting instant that you had truly escaped. But the palace, as Eliza had warned, had long arms. The head footman, a notoriously observant man named Mr. Finch, had noticed Samuel's unusual nervousness in the days leading up to the procession. He had also noticed the subtle, almost imperceptible exchange between Samuel and Eliza. Suspicion, once planted, festered. As the procession passed, Finch, rather than watching the spectacle, had kept a keen eye on the service gate. He saw Samuel slip through. The pursuit was swift and brutal. Samuel, disoriented by the sheer volume of people and the unfamiliar streets, was quickly apprehended by two palace guards, their grim faces reflecting the implacable authority of the institution. He struggled, desperate, but their grip was unyielding. His satchel was torn from his grasp, his forged letter crumpled, his compass tossed carelessly into the gutter. The dream, so vivid and tantalizing just moments before, shattered into a million pieces. He was dragged back, through the very gates he had hoped to leave forever, his face streaked with tears and grime. The guards, their faces impassive, delivered him to Mr. Finch, who stood waiting, a look of cold satisfaction on his face. "Foolish boy," Finch sneered, echoing Eliza's earlier words, but with a chilling finality. "Did you truly believe you could escape the king's service? The palace owns you, Samuel. Body and soul." The punishment was severe. Samuel was publicly beaten, a spectacle designed to crush his spirit and serve as a warning to all others. He was then confined to the deepest, most isolated parts of the scullery, his duties doubled, his rations halved. Eliza, too, faced retribution, though less severe, for her complicity. Her eyes, when they met Samuel's across the vast, impersonal kitchen, held a profound sorrow, a shared understanding of their broken dreams. Samuel's spirit, once rebellious, was now utterly crushed. The embers of hope had been extinguished, replaced by a cold, desolate despair. He moved through his days like a ghost, his eyes hollow, his movements slow. The palace had not just recaptured him, it had broken him. He had sought freedom but found only a harsher form of captivity. And as you witnessed his brokenness, you would understand the cruel illusion of escape, the terrifying truth that for many servants in the royal palace, the only true freedom was found in death, and even then their names would be forgotten, their lives reduced to a mere footnote in the grand, opulent history of their masters. The shadow of despair, it seemed, was far more pervasive than any glimmer of hope. Loyalty in the gilded halls of the royal palace was a currency demanded without question, yet rarely repaid in kind. Servants were expected to dedicate their entire lives, their very beings, to the service of their masters, often with the unspoken promise of security in their old age. But this promise, like so many others, was frequently a cruel mirage, dissolving into betrayal and abandonment in the twilight years of their lives. For old Margaret, a laundress whose gnarled hands had washed the royal linens for over 5 decades, this bitter truth was a devastating blow, a final, crushing injustice after a lifetime of unwavering devotion. You would feel that profound ache of betrayal, the cold, creeping dread of being discarded after giving everything, your life's work rendered utterly meaningless. Margaret had arrived at the palace as a timid girl of 15, her heart filled with a mixture of awe and trepidation. She had served 4 monarchs, witnessed countless births, deaths, coronations, and scandals. Her life was meticulously woven into the fabric of the royal household. She knew the precise temperature of water needed for the king's silk shirts, the exact amount of starch for the queen's elaborate ruffs, the delicate touch required for the princess's lace nightgowns. Her loyalty was absolute, unquestioning. She had foregone marriage, family, and a life of her own, dedicating every waking hour to the meticulous, back-breaking work of the royal laundry. Her body bore the marks of her devotion, perpetually aching joints, hands permanently stained and scarred from harsh lye soaps, a stoop in her back from years of bending over vast tubs of boiling water. She had always believed in the unspoken contract. Her unwavering service for the security of a roof over her head, a warm meal, and a quiet retirement within the palace walls. She had seen other older servants, those too frail to work, given small, undemanding tasks, a room in the infirmary, a measure of peace in their final years. This was her hope, her silent expectation, the reward for a life of thankless toil. You would understand that deep-seated belief, that desperate clinging to the idea that your sacrifices would ultimately be recognized, that your humanity would not be entirely forgotten. But times were changing. A new generation of courtiers, driven by efficiency and cost-cutting, began to scrutinize the household expenses with a cold, calculating eye. The old ways, the informal understandings, the quiet compassion for long-serving staff began to erode. The new Lord Chamberlain, a man named Stirling, was particularly ruthless, determined to modernize the palace and rid it of what he deemed superfluous expenses. One frigid winter morning, Margaret received a summons to the Lord Chamberlain's office, a place she had never set foot in during her entire half-century of service. Her heart fluttered with a nervous apprehension, but she reassured herself. Surely it was about a new fabric, a change in the Queen's wardrobe. She entered the opulent office, its warmth a stark contrast to the damp chill of the laundry rooms, feeling strangely out of place amidst the polished wood and elaborate furnishings. Lord Stirling, a man whose face was as sharp and unyielding as his tailored suit, did not offer her a chair. He simply looked at her, his gaze devoid of warmth or recognition. "Margaret," he began, his voice clipped and formal, "your service to the crown has been noted. However, the household is undergoing certain reorganizations. We have determined that your continued employment is no longer financially viable." Margaret stared at him, her mind struggling to comprehend his words. "Financially viable?" she repeated, her voice a thin, reedy sound. But I have served for 50 years, sir. I know every thread in this palace. I am needed." Stirling offered a dismissive wave of his hand. "Nonsense. There are younger, stronger hands available. We appreciate your dedication, of course, but the needs of the palace evolve. You are to be retired. Effective immediately." The words hit her like a physical blow, stealing the air from her lungs. Retired. Immediately. After 50 years. No pension, no commendation, no gentle transition. Just a brutal, unceremonious dismissal. You would feel that gut-wrenching shock, the sudden, terrifying realization that your entire life, your very identity, was being stripped away, rendered utterly worthless by a man who saw you only as an inconvenient line item on a ledger. "But where am I to go?" Margaret whispered, her voice trembling. "I have no family. No home outside these walls. The palace is my home." Lord Stirling merely shrugged, his expression utterly unmoved. "That is not the concern of the crown, Margaret. You will be given a small severance, enough for a few weeks' lodging. The gates will be open to you tomorrow morning. Ensure your belongings are gathered." He then turned his attention to a stack of papers, effectively dismissing her, leaving her standing alone in the vast, cold office, her world crumbling around her. Margaret stumbled out, her body suddenly feeling heavier, her steps faltering. The familiar corridors, once a source of comfort, now seemed alien, hostile. Every servant she passed, every familiar face, seemed to look away, their expressions a mixture of pity and fear. They knew. They understood. Her fate was a stark warning to them all. That night, in the cramped dormitory she had shared for decades, Margaret packed her meager belongings. A worn blanket, a few threadbare clothes, a small, faded locket containing a lock of her mother's hair. Each item felt like a shard of a broken life. Her hands, so accustomed to the robust feel of royal linens, now trembled with a profound, aching emptiness. The palace, which had consumed her youth, her strength, her very soul, was now casting her out, a used-up, broken vessel. As she walked out of the servants' entrance the next morning, the biting winter wind whipping around her frail form, the heavy gates clanged shut behind her with a sound of finality that echoed in her heart. She looked back at the towering walls, the grand windows, the silent, imposing facade that had been her entire world. There was no farewell, no recognition, no whisper of gratitude. Just the cold, indifferent stone. Her loyalty, absolute and unwavering for half a century, had been repaid with betrayal, a brutal eviction into a world she no longer knew, a world that held no place for an old, discarded laundress. And as you watched her disappear into the swirling mist of the city, you would feel the chilling weight of that truth. In the royal palace, loyalty was a one-way street, a sacrifice demanded but never truly honored, leaving only the bitter taste of abandonment in the twilight years of those who gave everything. The grand halls of the royal palace, now silent save for the occasional gust of wind rattling an ancient window pane, still hummed with an unseen energy, a lingering resonance of the countless lives that had been spent within their confines. The polished floors gleamed, the tapestries hung in regal splendor, the portraits of monarchs gazed down with an air of timeless authority. But beneath this veneer of enduring majesty lay the profound, often tragic legacy of the servants, the invisible architects, the silent custodians, the forgotten souls whose lives were the very foundation upon which royal splendor was built. You walking through these hallowed empty spaces would feel their presence, a haunting echo of their toil, their suffering, and their enduring silent strength. Centuries had passed since Margaret was cast out, since Samuel was broken, since Eleanor and Thomas first entered these imposing gates. The monarchs had changed, the political landscapes had shifted, but the fundamental structure of service, the relentless demands, the crushing anonymity, had remained a constant, an unbroken chain stretching through generations. The palace, in its unyielding grandeur, stood as a monument not just to the power of kings, but to the invisible labor of millions. Consider the intricate patterns on the ceiling, painted by artists whose names are celebrated, but painstakingly prepared by plasterers and apprentices who toiled in suffocating heat, their lungs filling with dust, their hands raw and bleeding. Think of the vast libraries filled with ancient texts, each volume meticulously dusted, catalogued, and preserved by diligent librarians and pages, their eyes strained by candlelight, their minds filled with the knowledge they could never truly claim as their own. Imagine the shimmering ballrooms, where royal couples danced beneath crystal chandeliers, each crystal hand polished by a servant perched precariously on a ladder, risking life and limb for a fleeting moment of sparkle. You would feel the weight of their collective effort, the sheer, unimaginable scale of human energy poured into maintaining this illusion of effortless magnificence. The very air you breathe in these rooms carries their stories. The faint scent of beeswax is not just a polish. It is the ghost of 1,000 hands, endlessly rubbing, buffing, striving for perfection. The smooth, cool stone of the staircases bears the invisible imprint of countless feet, ascending and descending day and night, carrying trays, messages, and the unspoken burdens of their masters. The intricate carvings on the furniture were not just the work of master craftsmen. They were cleaned and maintained by generations of housemaids, their fingers tracing every curve, every detail, ensuring the preservation of beauty they were forbidden to truly appreciate. Their lives were a testament to a profound paradox. They were utterly indispensable, yet entirely disposable. They built, they maintained, they served, yet they were rarely seen, rarely heard, rarely remembered. Their individual stories, like those of Agnes, Isabel, and William, were swallowed by the vast, impersonal narrative of royal history. Their triumphs were small, personal victories against overwhelming odds. Their tragedies, silent, unmourned sorrows. Yet their legacy endures. The seamless operation of the palace, the very existence of its splendor, is their enduring monument. Every perfectly brewed cup of tea, every freshly laundered sheet, every glimmering piece of silver, every polished floorboard, these are not just objects. They are echoes of their steps, whispers of their tireless hands, silent testaments to their unwavering, often unwilling dedication. The palace, in its present-day quietude, feels like a vast, breathing organism, its very pulse the culmination of centuries of human endeavor. You can almost hear the phantom clatter of pots from the kitchens below, the rustle of silk as a chambermaid quietly goes about her duties, the hushed whispers of intrigue from a distant drawing room. These are not just sounds from the past. They are the enduring vibrations of lives lived with a fierce, often brutal, intensity. The shocking lives of these servants were not just a footnote in history. They were the very text itself, written in sweat and tears, in sacrifice and silent resilience. They remind us that behind every grand facade, every display of power and privilege, there lies a human cost, a hidden history of struggle and endurance. And as you finally turn to leave these magnificent haunted halls, you carry with you not just the image of royal splendor, but the profound, indelible impression of the unseen, unacknowledged army of souls who made it all possible. Their echoes, though silent, resonate with a power that transcends time, a haunting reminder that the true stories of history are often found not in the grand pronouncements of kings, but in the quiet, enduring footsteps of those who served them.